Greetings, beautiful Herle Burlyites. I appreciate you loyal followers of our podcast because even though we may differ issue to issue, we speak the same language, politics. Okay, sometimes it's Caddyshack, peppered with Elton John and 1970s Saskatchewan Rough Rider wide receivers, but it's about 97% politics here on the Herle Burly. But there are communities out there for whom connecting because you're speaking the same language is not a metaphor. Here's a story about that, brought to us by our presenting sponsor, TELUS. It's a modern-day lesson in community building and cultural expression through a project to preserve and revitalize the Wet'suwet'en language. The project is critical for the Wits at First Nation, as well as other Indigenous communities across Canada, because the number of people who speak an Indigenous language well enough to have a conversation remains at about 3%, according to StatsCan. Among Witset's population, fewer than 100 of 2,200 members can speak Wet'suwet'en. But the recent arrival of TELUS Pure Fiber technology has spurred new opportunities to connect fluent Wet'suwet'en speakers with language students of all ages. They can now access vital online resources, such as First Voices, a website that allows speakers to upload written content, audio and video recordings of words, phrases, songs, and stories into a central database. Violet Gellenbeck, a Witset elder, says that in order to fully understand the Wet'suwet'en territory, history, culture, and traditions, one must understand and speak the traditional language. And she's grateful for the connectivity and new skills high-speed internet brings. To learn more, go to connectingcanadaforgood.ca. All right, let's get this podcast underway. It's another pandemic pod in two parts on the Herle Burly today, and I have a very special guest for part one. But before we get to that, I just want to thank all of our loyal Herle Burlyites for staying with us during the COVID crisis. Whether you're listening or watching us on YouTube, we appreciate you taking the time when you could otherwise be aimlessly scrolling the Netflix listings, which is an underappreciated form of entertainment in itself. My personal record is 1 hour and 33 minutes without actually watching anything. Beat that. For part one, we have the leader of the official opposition in Ontario and the leader of the New Democratic Party since 2009, Andrea Horwath. We're going to talk a little bit about her life and what animates her, the NDP's challenges in Ontario, elections from past and what happened there, and finally the Ford government in the next election, only 2 years away. On part two of the pod, it's Jenni, Byrne, and Scott Reid, better known as the political panel, the cussin' cousins, the swear siblings. Staying with the election theme, we're going to talk about what we think things are going to look like 2 years from now in Ontario and tell some election night stories from our past. Trigger warning. If the thought of Scott being loaded onto a campaign plane, semi-conscious and reeking of gin after all the beer and rum were already gone, upsets you, well, it's a podcast, and you can scroll right past that part. Andrea Horwath, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
It's absolutely my pleasure.
People should know, I guess, that you and I have never met before.
That's actually true. We have never met before.
We have never met before, so this is our virtual meeting, and what a pleasure it is for me. Thank you so much for coming on. I start these programs with all my guests. Yeah, great. I start this show with all my guests these days in the COVID environment by asking, how are you?
You know what? I'm okay. Thank you for asking. It's been a really rough go for sure. We've seen a lot of tragedy in our province, and it's keeping us all up at night. To be frank, but we're trying to soldier through. I mean, my family thankfully hasn't had any up close and personal, exposure, if you will, to COVID-19, but it can happen easily to anyone. So we're trying to do our best. And how about yourself?
I'm all right. I'm actually, I think I broke the law for a period of time, but I did it inadvertently. When I lived in Ottawa for many years, I had a cottage outside of Ottawa in the Gatineau in Quebec. And on March the 12th, Terry, my wife, and I came up here for the weekend. And over the course of that weekend, Ontario closed. So we've never been back. It's been pretty placid and nice up here. But for people trying to work and trying to live in the city, how's it affected your life?
Well, it's been interesting. I have to let my son know. My son's still living at home, and he is a producer of music, and so he's making a lot of noise in his little studio in the basement. So we have to kind of spell each other off in terms of who gets to be taking up the space in the house, because it's just a small condo in Hamilton that we live in. But it's the whole thing has been something that I've been able to luckily get some insights from others as well. So for the longest time, we couldn't get really much breakthrough in terms of media, because it was the Prime Minister, and then the ministers, and then the federal chief medical officer, and then Ford and his ministers, and the chief medical officer for Ontario, and then it was Mr. Tory and his chief medical officer. So needless to say, at the beginning, it was really hard for us to cut through. So what we ended up doing is a lot of, we called them, we're still doing them, digital kitchen table meetings. So we're just trying to, reach out to people and try to have conversations with folks about various pieces of the COVID situation. So small business owners in Toronto, for example, around the Danforth that MPP Peter Tabbins hooked me up with. I had a conversation just last week with some women educators. One was she was a supporter of her colleagues. So she's a teacher support, and then two teachers, all of whom had kids, and were telling me how hard it was for them to try to, take on the e-learning or the online learning with their students, while at the same time trying to deal with their own children, and the kind of the issue around devices in the home. And I've heard from parents. I've had meetings with parents as well about how hard it is to keep the kids engaged, and depending on the kids, right? Some kids are right into it. Other kids were less motivated, or having a really hard time. So it's been interesting for me.
Some of us need more structure.
Well, I hear you. That's absolutely true. But so it's been, so for me, we've kind of muddled about in terms of our kind of adjustments, if you will, because it's only my son and I, so that's not bad. But a lot of families are having a hard time. A lot of families are having a hard time just, trying to get through it, right?
Right. You talked about how early on there was no space in the news hole for you because it was all these officials making these announcements all the time. It also seemed early on that there was no space for political criticism of our leaders. Have you found that changing at all? Is there more space now for constructive comment about what's going on?
There is, and I'm thankful for that. I think it's become pretty clear here in Ontario that notwithstanding the government's assurances, they weren't ready for this COVID-19 pandemic in a lot of different ways. And so at first, you're right, you can't really criticize. Everybody just wants to know that somebody's in charge and taking care of things. But certainly we've I guess you could say, taken the gloves off in the last little while, because there's real answers that the government the government needs to provide to Ontarians. I mean, why when they said that they were ready for the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of long-term care, why weren't they telling the truth? Why was the Premier talking about iron ring around our long-term care homes when it's very clear that was never the case? And they weren't telling the truth about it. And so there are other pieces too, David, and you know how this works. As time goes on, we'll have a much more full report card or scorecard on the government's reaction or the way they handled the situation. But there are some things that are just glaring. I mean, the long-term care piece obviously is the biggest, but the testing has been a debacle. Communications have been weak and confusing, and people don't understand what they shouldn't be doing half the time, because the government's communications have been just really misleading or not clear and not direct. And when the Premier's going out to the cottage, now this is not against you now, I know you're at the cottage and you stayed, but Mr. Ford told everybody else not to go to the cottage, and then he went. It's right. Like when this thing the very first moment it started, really, when Mr. Ford on the Thursday, I think it was telling everybody, go away, have a great time on your March break. And then the very next day he had to dial that back. So it's, the communications have been, really, really poor, and they continue to be so. But there's a lot more, and we have a little bit of time to talk. So if you want me to get into more of the pieces, I'm happy to.
Well, let's just start with what's frustrating about this, because you've identified these things. It feels to me like the government completely wasted the lockdown time. There's no testing and tracing procedures that would have allowed us to open up with safety. I don't know what they did over that period of time. And the long-term care thing is a scandal, a flat-out scandal. And I know that it doesn't only fall on them, but it's a flat-out scandal. And yet, it would be the general impression in Ontario, would it not, that Doug Ford has done a good job of being the premier during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think that people, see him with his folksy talk, and he's in front of the cameras every single day, and I think people have found that to be, comforting in some way, or I guess they found him to be at least present, and that's been a relief for folks. Early on, I was saying that the bar can be a little bit low for that premier, and so that he's succeeded in doing what he's done is I guess a positive thing for him, for sure. I wish, though, that a lot more of the of the passion that he has when he gets to those press conferences, the connecting that he does with residents and with Ontarians would lead to more action, because there's a lot of talk, but somehow it seems like he's managed to not take responsibility for the fact that his government is responsible, and his ministers are falling down on the job when it comes to how Ontario is trying to help business and renters and people and through the crisis, right?
He used to stand on stage beside Christine Elliott and crap all over the testing that was going on. It was like, who are you talking to? She's right beside you, for God's sake.
But he gets away with it. I mean, I just find it crazy. He gets away with it. And for us, it's like, okay, how is this? This is not how it's supposed to work. He's supposed to be able, he's supposed to be able to say, this is our issue, our problem, and we're going to take care of it. They trust us. We're going to fix it. But instead, he throws everybody else under the bus.
I know. Are you going to be able to force him into a full public inquiry, independent public inquiry into long-term care, or is he going to have one of these private inquiries where he brings in Gordon Campbell to tell him what he wants to hear?
Right? I mean, that's what we're so worried about it. And it won't be just us. I mean, there is a growing chorus of people demanding that we have that full judicial public inquiry that, and you know how these things work, right? A true public inquiry will follow the story wherever it leads them. Do you know what I mean? It won't be scoped, and it won't have, the government won't have its thumb on it. All of the hearings, all of the testimony will be accessible to the public and the media, so that transparency will be there, and people's voices will be heard. I mean, so many people have gone through horrors during this pandemic with their loved ones in long-term care, and you were right. It's not new. Long-term care has been in a crisis for a long time. However, what happened in this COVID process has just been, it's been a nightmare. So those people deserve to have their voices heard as well. But a commission that's done behind closed doors, where the government's appointed people pick and choose who they're going to hear from, it's just not. Ontarians deserve so much better than that. It's just not good enough. Not good enough. So we're going to keep fighting.
They won't commit to it. Good, because they won't commit to it.
No, they haven't committed to it yet.
What would you? No. One of the things I'm sure they're not thinking about very much is something that's being talked a lot about, which is the unique impact of the COVID economic crisis and social in a lot of respects, but let's speak purely economic, on women, and how women bore the brunt of the job losses, and they are seemingly being rehired at half the rate that men are being rehired at. This has a lot to do with the industries that are opening up and when they're opening up, but it also has a lot to do with whether women can leave the house, given their childcare responsibilities. Do you foresee anything serious happening for Ontario women in terms of childcare support that would allow them to reintegrate into the workforce?
Well, we are certainly pushing for that. I mean, we early on were identifying that the COVID recession is going to be a she-cession. And that there will not be, there will not be a recovery without a she-covery. And so we've been trying to urge the government to really put some some speed around getting childcare centers back up and running, and making sure people have access to that support. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see what we've seen already, which is a much higher negative impact on women. And of course, here in Ontario, we just saw the job numbers come out, and we're not doing as well as in other provinces. I mean, we're still seeing job losses where other provinces are starting to see job gains. And I think that has a lot to do with how the government of Ontario has pretty much abandoned any, responsibility whatsoever for direct provincial supports. And whether that's direct provincial supports for commercial tenants. Well, apparently they announced something today. I've missed it, but I'll get the update. But we've been asking them for months for a Save Main Street plan, where we're helping, mom and pops and small business, medium-sized business to be able to pay the rent. So we were saying direct rent subsidies for these businesses. Why? Exactly for this reason, because as we start to open up, we wanted to make sure that businesses hadn't gone belly up in the interim, that there are actually businesses that are still, able to reopen and rehire their workforces and start getting the economy going again. But for some, and this was done in many provinces, BC, and I think Alberta, and I think Quebec even has done some work with the commercial.
There's a glaring vacuum here in Ontario.
Yeah, it's really terrible. I'm shocked actually at how much this government has gotten away with saying, well, we the federal government needs to come to the table. We need the federal government to be a partner. And you know what it's like. Lots of times people don't know where the program is coming from or who's really paying for the various support programs. And so Ford seems to have been able to ride on Trudeau's coattails a little bit when it comes to taking credit for some of the very little help that Ontarians are getting. But it's not good enough to say, landlords are good people too. And, I trust that they're going to help their tenants because it's in their best interest. And we know that that's not what's happening. Sure, there are some that are, but that's not public policy. Do you know what I mean? That's not how public policy should work. So it's a bit frustrating, and it's troubling.
Yeah, I
really.
think he announced a moratorium. I think he announced a moratorium on commercial evictions till the end of the summer today, or something like that. I'm not exactly clear, but that's something he could have announced 2 months ago and would have given small businesses a lot of certainty that they have not had.
Absolutely.
Over this period of time.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we were asking for. We were asking for rent help. We were asking for a moratorium on evictions, commercial evictions, and we were asking for a freeze on utility payments, just to help with cash flow, to help with the ability to stay afloat.
Don't get me talking about these people and electricity prices, okay? I'll go crazy.
I know they're going in the wrong direction, right? They're going up again. Don't talk to me about electricity. Kathleen Wynne sold off Hydro One. I wasn't happy about that.
Right. Yeah, I know. You know what? None of us like it, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't even think she was on the show. She said she didn't really like doing it either. Tell us a little bit about yourself. In reading your background, Andrea, it seems to me that you have always been involved in community service. From the time that you were a young person entering the workforce, you wanted to work in the community as an activist in the community. Where did that come from, that impetus?
I don't know where it actually came from, but you're right. It's always been there. It's always been kind of who I am as a person. I guess I'm somewhat of an empathetic person, and I like to help. I like to try to make change happen. And it's interesting because I did do a lot of work in the community, both as an activist volunteering, and then also I worked for co-op housing. I worked for a while right out of university with the Labor Council doing English as a second language and literacy training for workers, because at that point there was a recession and workers who had gotten a job at the plant by just walking up to the gate, no applications, no resumes, all of a sudden we're out of work, right? And we were trying to help folks to get some basic skills together to be able to get out there into the employment world. But I don't know. It's always been that way for me. And before city council, the last job I had was with the legal clinic, with the McQuestion Legal and Community Services. Again, tenant advocacy and anti-poverty, and of course Hamilton, so environmental, environmental issues were big. So I worked with all of these folks, single moms, the Indigenous community. We have a big Indigenous community in Hamilton. It's just, and it's, for me, it's what fulfills me. I just, when I finally got elected to city council, it was after the Plastimet fire, which you might not recall it, but it was a huge 4-day fire that raged in the north end of Hamilton. And that was, for me, it was funny. Finally, it was, I can't just bang on the doors of power from the outside. If change is going to happen, you got to put yourself through the process of trying to be on the inside at the decision-making table to actually make a difference. And so that's where the transition happened.
Were your parents political?
Yeah, well, my dad was an auto worker, so I'm from Steel Town, but my dad was an auto worker, and so he was political in a couple of ways. He was always active in his union. I mean, he never ran for office or anything, but he would get the at that time it was, I think initially it was the UAW still, and then eventually CAW, right. and those the union newsletters would come to the house, and I'd often pick them up and leaf through them. We always went to the union picnic at Crystal Beach every summer, and so more exposure to the union and the great things it does for people. And then there were strikes when my dad was working at Ford in Oakville, and so our family went through those processes as well. But my dad also volunteered politically. He volunteered a lot at the municipal level in Stony Creek at the time, which is now part of Hamilton. But I was no stranger to Dad going out to do some canvassing and then coming back home swearing his head off because he got chased by a dog. My dad hated dogs. Too many times on the campaign trail, he got chased by dogs.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I grew up a liberal in Saskatchewan. Dogs are the least of your problems.
Yeah, that's good. There's always good campaign stories, from the doorsteps, from the buses, from the planes, from everywhere.
Sure. Given that background of yours, how do you feel watching the protests and marches going on across Canada and the world right now?
Oh, it's so empowering. I mean, of course, the reason for the protests happening was just brutal. And watching what happened to George Floyd was just, it was horrifying. So seeing, though, the rising up of solidarity rallies and marches, like literally worldwide, it's been so amazing. And look, when I was at the McQuestion Legal Clinic back in the day, I was also the co-chair of the Community Coalition Against Racism. We're talking over 30 years ago now, or around 30 years ago. I gotta say, not a lot has changed. Not a lot has changed. We still see so much systemic racism and so much blatant hate and racism that exists in our communities. It's brutal. But I think watching what's happened over the last couple of weeks now, it's been, for me, really inspiring and really hopeful that finally we can shift gears here. We can finally get something happening when it comes to justice for Black people, for Indigenous people, for other racialized folks. It's just extremely it's an extremely important moment in time, and we can't. I don't think we can't afford to lose the momentum that's happening here. So that means real changes have to come. And we saw a government here in Ontario that watered down Justice Tulloch's recommendations around policing reform. We voted against that when the Conservatives watered it down. They used it as a bit of a political, bat to hit us with. But you have to do that work. You have to do that work and make those changes if it's ever going to be addressed. And so I'm committed to continuing that work. And you know what? I'm really proud because we actually have 6 members of our caucus that actually form a Black caucus for the first time in Ontario. Ontario's never had a Black caucus before. We have a Black caucus. It's headed up by Laura May Lindo, who is our MPP for Kitchener Centre, and she's amazing. And all of those caucus members are amazing, and they've really helped us as a party and as an official opposition make sure that we're listening to Black voices, and we're pushing really hard to deal with the barriers that Black people face, the discrimination that they face, the racism that they face, throughout all systems. So the education system, the healthcare system, the political system. I mean, we all know how it goes, right? It's going to take a lot of work, but I'm proud that we have a core group of MPPs that are doing that work. It's really great.
Is it a bit of a cop-out for Canadians to get outraged and march in great numbers in support of George Floyd and racial injustice in the United States toward Black people, when we are the most racist country toward Indigenous people that you could imagine? There's nobody, and I don't mean to take anything away from anybody's experience, but there's no ethnicity that is more discriminated against than Indigenous people in Canada are. There's nobody of prominence in the entire country who's an Indigenous person other than in the Indigenous world.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're right on. You're right on. I mean, our country has a history of cultural genocide when it comes to our Indigenous sisters and brothers, right? I mean, that's our history. We have the First Nations MPP that's ever been elected. He's from north of Thunder Bay area. And he's fantastic. His name's Saul Mamakwa. But I have to say, one of the things that we're always being very careful about is making sure that we're not putting it all on Saul's shoulders, right? I mean, so it's easy for us to say we have this MPP. He's from Kingfisher Lake, a First Nation in the northwest of Ontario. He doesn't have to carry all the water. We make sure he doesn't have to carry all the water. We do everything we can to support him and to make sure that we're all talking about Indigenous racism that exists. And I mean, just the horrifying examples that we continue to see, not only in Ontario, but across the country. It's really, really troubling. And I think the more, we talk about it and the more we acknowledge it, then it requires action. But, we've seen some studies and some recommendations missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And I mean, at the end of the day, we have to just not do this work in terms of the consultation and the reports and the recommendations. We need to actually implement. So, I mean, we have other Indigenous members of caucus as well, folks that are Métis and various backgrounds, and we're excited about that. But Saul is he carries a lot, I got to tell you. He's actually mourning the loss of his nephew who passed away, who actually died by suicide just last week in the Thunder Bay jail. So there's lots of pieces that we need to support Saul on, and he's doing great work.
Yeah, that's a thing that's common in that world that most people never encounter at all. It would sure be nice at some point to see tens of thousands of people in the streets of Montreal or Toronto for Indigenous equality.
Yeah, I hear you. I agree.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about you as a partisan political actor in Ontario. So,
sure.
Let's go back to 2014.
Yep.
And I just want to test a theory. I want to run a theory by you about that period for the NDP. And I'd just like to get your reaction to it. Which is, you ran on a much more progressive platform in 2018 than you did on 2014, and I'm not that conversant with your platform in 2011, so we'll just leave it aside. And you could argue that Wynne ran to the left of you in 2014 in the election campaign, and Trudeau ran to the left of Mulcair in the 2015 election campaign. And it seemed to me that as the party got close to power, it felt it needed to shift to the center and adopt a form of fiscal responsibility that it hadn't traditionally been known for in order to cement that deal and get government. And that the NDP moved to the right just as the actual population was moving to the left, and ended up with that disconnect all across the country for New Democratic parties and governments, with the exception of Rachel Notley, through that period, 2013, 2014, 2015. Am I wrong about that?
Well, I don't kind of see it in quite the same terms. When our platform, if you actually took the time to look through our 2014 platform, it was in fact very progressive. Did we talk about things like acknowledging that you have to have some kind of fiscal responsibility? Yeah, we did, because we heard a lot from folks who were saying, we like everything you talk about, but where do you get the money? So we didn't talk about things like austerity, which is what the Liberals actually do when they get in office. They talk a good game when they're running for election, but when they get into office, they are not as left as people think. But having said that, what we also did was we tried to reconnect with some of working class Ontario, frankly. So we tried to put in place in our platform and more importantly in our campaign, an attempt to reconnect with working class Ontarians. And some of our base saw that as being populist in a negative way. But what we were trying to do is say that we have all of the same values and beliefs, and our platform reflected, all of it, affordable housing and childcare and everything. But you know what, a platform's different than what you put in the window during a campaign and what you focus on. And so what we were trying to do is reconnect with working class Ontarians, and I think that's what created the impression that we were politically moving to the right, which I didn't see that as what we were doing at all. But I guess it's moot because that's what everybody else saw.
Well, once the Toronto Annex elites got at it, it was a done deal. Was our right-wing populist platform.
Yeah.
So then let's jump ahead to 2018. I thought halfway through the election that you were going to win. Based on what I saw happening to Ford, based on what I saw in the trajectory of your numbers, I thought you were going to win halfway through. Why couldn't you ultimately beat him?
Well, this is what we ask ourselves all the time after a campaign's over. And what you saw happening in the last week or so, week and a half of the campaign was, I think, a number of pieces that converged. Ford surrounded himself with these, people that he called his, cabinet potential to try to, show people that it wouldn't be just him and that these folks with calmer histories and, coming from different perspectives, at least in terms of their experience, would be a buffer for against his kind of style, if you will. But on top of that, they pushed really hard that last week and a half on the negative stuff, right? On pulling stuff out of people's Facebook pages. If you remember, we were poppy haters and we were police haters and we were this and we were that and we were crazy. And so they really had a lot of ammunition. Well, not a lot of ammunition, but they had a lot of push for their ammunition. Do you know what I mean? They still had a lot of a well-funded campaign, and they could put a lot of steam behind that negative piece. And then there was the issue, and I can't tell you how disappointed I am about it. I still, to this day, I'm disappointed about it. Because of the issue around striking, around people having the right to strike, when Kathleen basically said that because I won't step in and legislate people back to work, then they'd be better off with Ford than they would be with the NDP, and that didn't help those last couple of days, right? It didn't help at all, and it was a problematic situation. And then of course we were stuck in a situation where there just even wasn't enough time to change tracks and push back against that dual attack. And that was for me really troubling, really, to watch that go down. I got it when it came to the negative piece that the Tories were pushing at us, but when the Liberals did what they did those last couple of days, it was extremely disappointing. I think that in a large part helped Mr. Ford go across the finish line with those extra couple percentage of votes.
Okay, so let me just say that from my perspective, I didn't think we were ever saying that people would be better off with Ford, but we did certainly campaign against the NDP's position on back to work legislation. Why didn't you just change your position? Because
it's not what I believe. And it's constitutionally protected, which and which you have seen come down a number of times. when these things go to the higher courts, they're always overturned. And so it's a political win at the moment for a government, because you can say you're knocking down those unions. But when of course the decisions are overturned, the public pays the price in terms of what might have been sold as something that's going to save money if you legislate people back to work. At the end of the day, it never does. At the end of the day, you lose it at the Supreme Court, and it costs, if not the same amount, more money. But it's also poisoned the work environment as well. So it's a lose from my perspective. So I still am of the position and of the opinion, based on the facts, that legislating back to work is not an effective thing to do. And what we've always said is, what you have to do is prevent the friction from getting to the point where you can't hammer out a deal. And that's where I think governments need to spend more time, as hammering out the deal, and not over politicizing the bargaining process.
Okay. I hear that. I hear that, and that's a legitimate point of view. I'm just trying to genuinely understand, what is the underlying headwind that the NDP face in Ontario? So now we've seen in the polls that there seems to be a default movement back to Liberal support. They're either first or second in most polls, with the Ford government being first or second against them. Why does that happen? Like, what is it? Like, you're the official opposition. You decisively trounced the Liberal Party in the last election. Those people voted for you. They were comfortable, and then they just drift. What is going on there? Is it still Ray? Is it a Liberal branding thing? What is the headwind the Ontario NDP face?
Well, I mean, I don't know. And I think I would say, though, David, a lot of the polls that I've been seeing recently, they have a kind of a three-way thing going on. And the NDP has never, in between elections, even before the first time they were elected provincially, has never been, in the high 20s or low 30s in between elections, ever. I mean, when I took over as leader, we were at 13% in the polls. It was, not a good thing. But having said that, so I don't want to. I just don't want to leave it there that we're third, when in a number of the polls, it's all three parties are kind of neck and neck. But
it doesn't matter right now. It doesn't matter right now anyway. I agree with you.
But yeah, it doesn't. It'll matter in 2 years' time. It'll matter. But it is interesting though, because you're right. I mean, the Liberals did get trounced in the last election, and then there's still people that are. I think are thinking about that and wondering why this is happening. But you know as well as I do that a lot of people don't differentiate between federal and provincial. They could be actually literally going to the polls and maybe not even realize that it's a provincial election versus a federal election. I think a lot of what's happening is right now federally is what's taking people's attention, right? And so how Mr. Trudeau is doing as the Prime Minister, I think is having an impact on people's opinion of the Liberals. But I mean, I think that it's going to be interesting. The next election, of course, is going to be one where the Liberals here in Ontario are headed up by Stephen Del Duca. And I think a lot of Liberals are pretty disappointed in the new leader, because he's...
What's your take on him?
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know him all that well. But I do know he's more to the right within the Liberal tent than many others. I mean, he sat at the cabinet table while some of the really not great decisions were being made by the Wynne government. And look, this is a guy who tried to get, who actually did get Metrolinx to build a subway station kind of in his backyard because he wanted it, and it wasn't recommended necessarily by Metrolinx. The same guy that broke the rules around getting a pool in his backyard when it came to the approvals. And so people don't like that about politicians, when they use their influence or they use their power to help themselves or to help themselves politically. Folks get really upset about that, and that's the kind of guy you got. And I'm going to be really interested to see how he's able to attract the voters in Ontario. It's going to be interesting.
What do you think they're going to be looking for, voters?
in 2020?
Yeah,
2022, sorry.
Yeah, you scared me there for a minute.
Yeah.
No, you know what? You know this. I mean, who knows? Nobody knows. 2 years from now is a long time. But I can tell you what we're still going to be working on. We're going to be working on long-term care to really deal with the crisis in long-term care. You know that in the last campaign, one of the things that people really loved was the dental program. We had a full day dental program as part of, we had pharmacare and dental care. And I can tell you, there were a lot of, folks who...
Very important to elderly people, eh?
Right. And folks who had worked all their lives and had dental plans at work, and then retired. And then there was the eureka moment because it's so expensive. And of course, your teeth, as you get older, it's harder to maintain them, right? And a lot of conservatives, I met a lot of conservatives during that campaign who...
You have a fine set of teeth by the looks of it.
Thanks. My parents were always very, very on the teeth thing. 4 kids, it could be pretty expensive to have to get your kids' teeth fixed all the time. But that's exactly the kind of thing that, as I was starting to say, a lot of conservatives liked that because they were now retired. These older fellows particularly, I don't know how many of them I spoke to who said, it would really make a difference in my life if I could actually have my dental covered. So it was a good program. So these are the kinds of things that we believe in, and so we're going to continue to work on and show Ontarians that we can have a hospital system where you don't have people lined up in the hallways trying to get care, and we can have dental care so that people don't have their teeth rotting out of their mouth when all their lives they've been proud of being able to have good oral health, right? So, in terms of what the ballot question is going to be in 2022, who knows? I mean, it's too far away to determine at this point. Do you have any ideas? What do you think it's going to be?
In 2020, I don't have any ideas. I'm out of this business. A flash out of ideas. In 2020, sitting here as we are, 2 years removed from your lousy night and my devastating night, what is the case against the Ford government? Give me the synopsis of why these people should not be in office past 2022.
Well, I mean, look at Mr. Ford's track record. I mean, all you have to do is see what Mr. Ford has done and the way he runs Ontario. It's all about the back rooms. Remember the Ron Taverner, debacle, where he tried to have a very good friend of his become the commissioner of the OPP. And it just goes on and on from there. I mean, we've seen the appointments of Rob Ford's former chief of staff to a plum position in the States, the former president of the party, the Conservative Party, as another plum appointment. To an ambassador type of position in the States. We've just watched this nightmare rip through the long-term care system, and some big movers and shakers within the Conservative Party have now registered as lobbyists for these for-profit long-term care homes. These are the kinds of, we watched the government of Ontario they literally interfere in the Toronto elections because they didn't like crazy lefty New Democrats, right? They call kids on university campuses Marxist because they have student unions. I mean, it's just nuts. So, it's these kinds of things I think that, folks like you and I, it drives us batty. Like I can't stand it. But it does have a damaging effect on our province and on governance. I mean, look, we are literally facing a pandemic while the government is still, for the first couple of weeks anyways, was still having public health units consult about this overhaul of public health. So they took the recommendations from SARS and started watering them down right before the pandemic hit, all right? The issue of making sure we have well-funded local public health units that are funded at the provincial level. The government was cutting funding from public health. They cut 10% of funding from public health. Now, that's obviously been pushed back in because they had no choice, but this is the kind of thing that they do. They cut $34 million from long-term care in 2019 budget. I mean, and they knew long-term care was on its knees. Everybody knew that. So, these are the kinds of things that show that the government is not bringing a thoughtful public policy perspective to the decisions they're making. They're driving an austerity agenda that's going to hurt people, and it already is hurting people.
All right. I have very little time with you left, and I want to just run through some quick snappers to get your take on some very quick take on a few things.
Okay.
Basic income. Where are you at?
I think it's something we definitely have to look at. It's shown, I think this COVID-19 pandemic has shown that there's opportunity to start looking more closely at that. And shame on Mr. Ford for shutting down that basic income pilot project.
But it doesn't sound like that's a priority for you yet. You're not certain that that's the right income support place to go?
Well, I mean, there's a lot more work, I think, that needs to be done in terms of levels of support, in terms of, all kinds of other pieces. But it's something absolutely that's on the radar.
Okay. Ending private long-term care homes and bringing them into the public system. Do you support that?
Absolutely. That's something we were calling for, and that we asked the government to include in the public inquiry, the role of for-profit corporations in long-term care.
I'm just, as an aside, I'm just stunned that these people have not even felt compelled to defend themselves through this period of time. They feel their situation with the government is so solid that they haven't even had to come out and manage their reputations through this period of time.
I know.
Wild.
That tells a story in and of itself, right?
Sure does. Defund the police.
You know what, David, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting in terms of what does defund actually mean? And if it means taking the ballooning resources that keep going to more and more police budgets and redirecting some of that funding to the roots of violence, to programs for young people, to help with affordable housing and creating of opportunity, and starting to tackle some of that systemic racism that exists in our institutions. I mean, that's what we stand for. That's what New Democrats believe needs to happen. And it's interesting. A couple of budgets ago, I shouldn't say a couple of years ago, my life goes by government budgets, but
budgets.
There was, I mean, you know how this works. When a budget's coming up, there's an engagement of stakeholders, and folks come and they give deputations on what they think the government should and shouldn't do. And I can remember a couple of years ago, the chiefs of police were in Queen's Park asking for their budgets to be capped, and any money that would have gone to increasing policing budgets needed to go into mental health. And that's what they were saying. So I think even the policing institutions know that they're doing jobs that they shouldn't have to do. Like, there are frontline mental health workers. There are frontline social workers. That shouldn't be happening. So making sure that we're resourcing the kinds of things that prevent some of the horrible situations that young people find themselves in. Trying to provide programs and supports to prevent violence and to help Black youth to see a future for themselves and not have to turn to other means to try to get through. These are all things we need to do for sure.
I'm not a subject matter expert on this at all. I've read a lot of very disturbing things about the militarization of police forces, especially in the United States, etc. But this feels to me like the classic way of how progressives take defeat from the jaws of victory. Here we have the large majority of people rallying in our favor. Black Lives Matter, end racial discrimination, George Floyd. And as these people are walking down the streets, and then we say, defund the police. And be like, really? Am I for that? All right. I mean, it's seems like a pretty good way to cut your coalition in half right away.
No, I hear you. And we're having these conversations as well as a caucus. And again, I mean, it's not, I mean, I don't think anybody imagines that you can completely abolish policing completely. But you know as well as I do that for years we've tried to move more towards a community-based policing type of model, to get away from the kind of the kind of militarized kind of view or way of doing things, and that we really haven't had all that much success in that regard. But I think if we go back to looking at exactly what role do the police have, and how do we make sure that we're doing other things to keep society, in good shape. Then that's what we have to do. So again, mental health funding and programs for kids, after school programs. A lot of, Mr. Ford cut a lot of youth programs through last summer, and that impacted largely racialized youth. So yeah, we have to be really thoughtful about where it is that we're putting public money, and how we try to raise people up as opposed to just enforce the law when something goes wrong.
Andrea, I got to let you go. Thank you so much for this. It's been such a fun conversation, and I appreciate, you know what? You're courageous to come on this show because,
Hey, they don't call me.
You had reason.
They don't call me the Steeltown Scrapper for nothing, David.
I guess you're not afraid of me. Good for you.
Well, it was nice
Thanks for
chatting.
coming on. And good luck and stay healthy.
Thanks. You do the same. Take care.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
If we've learned anything over the past few weeks, it's that in times of crisis, governments matter. So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what's happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning, so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. The only way to really get the detailed boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today, but there's also BC Today and Alberta Today, which are great for people who want to know what's going on out west but don't have the time to follow it closely. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. Tell them that the Herle Burly sent you, and they'll give you a 10% discount. Hey, Scott, Jenni, it's Tuesday morning. We've reassembled the panel. Jenni, have you figured out, you're out in Fenelon Falls, and it looks gorgeous where you are.
I am. It's fantastic.
So you got out.
I got out of the city, and it's like a whole different world here. Like people are chill. It's nice. It's going to be 32 degrees Celsius today. The lake is clear. I've already done some fishing. So, it's nice. It's great.
Well, as you can see, my basement has a great deal to offer also. There's the sound of birds if I turn the bird channel on, but that's about it.
No, it's fantastic. My dad's come. We've been here 2 days. My dad's come and visited both days. He's already been here. It's like 8:15 a.m. and he's already been here for a visit this morning. So it's great.
Super props for your Expos hat.
Thank you.
I love the
Expos.
I miss the Expos.
Me too. It always brings a warm, nostalgic feeling just to see that logo.
My
all-time favorite Expo. Who?
Tim Wallach.
Ellis Valentine.
I loved third. I played third base when I was a kid. I had a really good glove, but a shitty arm. But he was my favorite player.
I love the Hawk. Number 10. He wore number 10. LaFleur wore number 10. You couldn't peel the number 10 off of me when I was a kid. I love the Hawk. And built like a kite, right? Beautiful wide shoulders, tiny, teeny little waist. What a monster athlete.
He was. I just loved Ellis Valentine's cannon of an arm from the outfield. He was trying to steal home on Ellis Valentine. Fun time.
But it's sad because they had to get rid of Ellis Valentine to go to the next level.
Yeah, I know. Jenni, have you committed to memory all of the rules and regulations about what you're allowed to do now in or out of Toronto?
Has anyone? The fact of the matter is whether you're in or out of Toronto, I think most people have been doing a lot of these things regardless. I think the government is really behind the 8 ball and behind most people. The social gatherings from 5 to 10, but you've got to stay 2 meters apart. Somehow splash pads and tattoo parlors are allowed, but you can't go and get a facial. So I think people are happy. It's given people some hope that things are opening up, but it's terribly inconsistent and there's absolutely no common sense that goes along with any of these decisions.
I think you guys are being too hard. These rules, I mean, just yes, it takes a few minutes, but pay attention. And I'm in downtown Toronto. I'm still in stage 1, but I'm building a church in my backyard.
This is building up to a joke, right? This is building up to a joke, right?
I'm building a church with a patio and a splash pad. When I want to be around fewer people, I'll just have a funeral. But it's going to be okay. I hate it. It's just.
Make sure you turn the music down. A friend of mine, Jack Ben Simon sent me the regs that said no live music allowed in restaurants, and if you have recorded music, please turn it down.
Sorry, people here are trying to be miserable. Do you mind?
Hey, Scott, you're getting to where I was a month and a half ago.
Oh, I know. I'm just joking. What my big beef is where we were a month and a half ago, which is like, where do these rules come from? Like, none of it's connected to public health, right? Like, I mean, they go, okay, well, Friday, we'll open Friday. Thursday? No, Friday. We'll open on Friday, but only here. And no indication of how many cases per day for how many days in a row, within what jurisdiction. None of that to guide us. So they must be using those things to make decisions. Like they say, well, we're going to review next Monday, make an announcement the following Friday. Well, what changes? And the point I've always made, which is, and what if we see a spike in cases, because we're seeing it in the States now where they've reopened, like how many cases have to go up over what period of time before we go, all right, we're alarmed and we're going to roll back? Or do we not roll back and we just say, you know what, forget it. All that was just a big fucking nightmare and it's Joker's wild now. Like, there's no guidance on any of that.
But this has been the consistent inconsistency with the government reporting. So, as I've said numerous times, and I won't fully repeat myself, the reason we locked down was to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed. And every single day, up until yesterday, Christine Elliott and government officials stood up, and all they talked about was cases. They didn't talk about the fact that there were less than 100 cases in the ICU. They didn't talk about there was less than 80 people on ventilators until yesterday, when obviously public health officials were dragged to this event or to this announcement, kicking and screaming. It was evident that they did not want to do this second phase of opening up outside the Golden Horseshoe, to which then they started talking about hospitalization. So it's not, we can't look at cases anymore. We actually have to look at hospitalization. So as I said, politicians consistently and public health officials keep changing the goalpost. And we saw that yesterday with the WHO coming out and saying, oh, by the way, asymptomatic people, we don't think that you actually can transmit it if you're asymptomatic. Really? Because we shut off the entire fucking world because of that exact reason.
But isn't that one fair ball?
I just want to take Bugs Bunny's mallet and start beating those World Health Organization people over the head.
Oh, come on. Isn't that one valid? But I understand it's frustrating, but Jesus Christ, like, the thing's been in existence for 4 months. Like, it's a prudent assumption that asymptomatic spread would exist, and if they've discovered that it isn't, are they supposed to say, fuck, don't tell anybody?
No, but that's not the way it worked. First they didn't know, and then they said asymptomatic transfer. This was a discovery. This was a finding. This was an important consideration. We were mocking Christine Elliott for having discovered it so late in the day that there was asymptomatic transfer. To come out yesterday and say that they don't think it happens. I mean, Jenni's right. That was a pretty big part of the deal.
It's the reason we've all locked down. It's the reason stores have been closed and restaurants have been closed, and millions of people in North America and around the world are out of work. And frankly, it's been longer than 6 months. One of the other things that came out in a study yesterday is that in satellite imagery of hospital parking lots in Wuhan, the province in China, is that actually it was like November and December that there were higher rates of people going into the hospitals. So we're talking about something that's actually, it's not 4 months, it's not 6 months, it's looking like 8 or 9 months that we know of now that the virus has been in existence.
Okay, I get all that, but I'm just going to be the big apologist. Like, in all honesty, like it drives me crazy too. But the fact that like it's a novel virus, so as it becomes, it's been 4 months that it's been known since January, since it's been a known entity, right? It was literally on December 31st that WHO learned about it, right?
It's June. That's 6 months.
Okay, so
ago.
6 months. So they find out about the thing, and they're like, isn't it, since it's literally a novel virus, don't we have to put up with the fact that discovery is a messy and inconsistent process, and they learned something and they thought something was right and it turns out that thing's wrong? Like, that's the way it goes, man.
They shut the world down because they said that asymptomatic people can give it to each other. And now they're saying no.
Well,
they
asymptomatic.
Pardon me?
And symptomatic.
If it's just symptomatic people, isn't it the same rules as a bloody cold or a flu? Don't go out if you're sick. And if you see people who are sick, stay away from them.
I guess, but they didn't know.
It was the threat of asymptomatic transfer that was the threat.
I'm as frustrated as anybody, but jeepers, they don't know. They're making this stuff up as they go along because they're learning as they go along.
Exactly. They are making it up as they go along. And
so yeah, you have to make it up on the side of trying to not have people die.
They said with certainty.
Well, they didn't do that with masks.
They didn't, Scott. They never once said, we think that asymptomatic people can transmit the virus, but we're not sure. They said with absolute 100% certainty, asymptomatic people can give it to each other, which is why the 6 feet social distancing bullshit that everyone's been doing for the last 4 to 6 months. So anyway,
what I find amusing about yesterday is that in a world in which governments have lost complete control of their populations, and people have just decided to go out and do whatever the fuck they want to do, and have whatever activity they want to have, that the government thought that such finely detailed orders and instructions and differences would be followed by the population. I mean, you couldn't get people to all do one thing anymore, much less 800 different variations of rules. It's hysterical. It's the most irrelevant thing out there.
Has this altered the way you worship, David, so far?
I've been... I've not been in a house of worship for many, many years, absent a special occasion. The last time I really tried to pull off a house of worship was when my mother, in 1990, came to visit me, and back then I was what I called a C-E&M Catholic. Christmas, Easter, when my mother's in town. And so my mom comes to visit me in my apartment at King and Bathurst. And I had scoped out the neighborhood church so that it would look like I go. And I knew what time the Mass was. And so, high Mass, 10 o'clock in the morning on Sunday, we get out, we march directly to the church. Look like I know exactly what I'm doing. We sit down in the pew. The priest comes out, starts the Mass in Portuguese. And my mother, bless her heart, never said a thing. Really hasn't changed the way I worship at all, Scott. What I want to start with, first of all, I got a book. I forgot my book last week. I got a book this week. It's called The Dark Side by Steve Paikin. Steve has a couple of books out about politics. One's called The Life, which sort of celebrates people's successes in politics. This one is called The Dark Side. And I like both books a lot, but I like this one even a little bit more because it's quite relatable to, the shitty side of politics, what happens when you lose, what the emotions are like when you lose, what happens to people. The Dark Side, Steve Paikin knows as much about politics in Canada as anybody does, and always worth listening to, and that is a great read. Jenni, Andrea Horwath, I talked to her yesterday, it's on the first part of this pod, told me when I asked her why she couldn't beat Ford in 2018, told me that there were 2 reasons, and she only identified 2 reasons. One was the negative attack ads that the Ford campaign ran, and one was the criticisms of their opposition to back-to-work legislation in the context of the York University strike that the Liberal Party put a spotlight on. Is that your analysis of how the 2018 campaign was one for you, that we attacked the NDP and you went negative at the end, and that's all it took?
No, I don't think that's fair. I thought the interview with Andrea, I thought the first part of the interview was great. I thought she was very engaging, very, genuine, very, very likable, relatable. I think the first part of the interview was something that you can see why people are drawn to her. I felt the second part of the interview where it was more a little bit of political analysis or kind of looking in a mirror in terms of the last few elections weren't entirely accurate. And I'm not sure there's been a lot of self-reflection that's kind of happened since the 11 and 14 and 18 campaigns. And so I think it's unfair to say that Kathleen Wynne was to blame or negative attack ads are to blame. Campaigns matter, and that's where I think the NDP lucked out in some ridings. There were ridings in downtown Toronto, Spadina, Fort York, University Rosedale, Toronto Centre. They had no business winning, and frankly, they're not going to. Even if they ran a great campaign next election, they're not going to win again. So I just don't think there's been any reflection as to what they need to do as an organization, that they need to do as a party, to be able to kind of take it up to the next step. Because I believe, like we touched on Singh last week, I think that they are a party that is floundering both at the provincial and at the federal level.
Yeah, and I gave her a chance to expound on that. Like, let me be clear, I really liked the interview, and I really liked her. Actually, I thought it was a fun conversation to have. But either she hasn't thought about those campaigns, 2014 and 2018, and the federal dynamic in an honest way, or she was unprepared to talk about it in an honest way, because there's clearly something with the NDP, both generally in Ontario, but particularly currently, that they need to fix and they need to figure out. And they've been sort of flailing around on the spectrum from right of center to where Singh is now, and I don't think they've found much of a sweet spot. Anyway, thank her for coming on. That was fun. But in any event, the 2018 campaign, just to go back to that, Jenni, because I told her that halfway through the campaign, I thought she was going to win, based on what I saw in the data, the trajectory of the polls, and where they were gaining, etc. What do you think turned that thing around in the second half?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you. There were almost no days that I sat in the war room and I thought that we were not going to win that election. There were some days that were dicier than others, but in terms of the NDP, it is, the NDP doing well is not generally a bad thing for Conservatives. You see the 2011 election for us federally. I'm not saying it's the only factor. You look at in 2018. So there was never a moment, and a lot of the cases where we were doing very targeted polling in ridings in different regions for our target ridings. So we kind of knew where we were, where we needed to win. So I'm not sure that there could have really been any changes that would have happened in the election that would have changed the outcome at least significantly from where it was. Maybe seats here or there, but I don't think the actual outcome.
Well, aren't we just dissecting the obvious? I mean, to me, at minimum, the fundamental precondition of success in an election for the Liberals or the NDP is the weakness of the other. So, one of the benefits that the Conservatives have, one of the challenges for the Conservative is that the other parties hold a majority of the political spectrum by and large. So it takes a big change election usually for Conservatives to sort of win out of the gate. And otherwise, you need to have a tactical victory where the other two parties cancel each other out and you're able to score off that. And so what I found striking about Horwath is the obvious precondition is that the NDP need the Liberals to do poorly in order to win, and vice versa. The Liberals need the NDP to do poorly to win. And so in that context, there's never going to be an expectation that the NDP are going to roll over an election and just bark, we're done, in order so that the Liberals can take on what's left of the Conservatives. Neither are the Liberals going to roll over and do so for the NDP. So I don't know why she would have expected that. I don't know why she thought that That was why she lost. To my mind, the failure was that her campaign did not recognize that with a historical level of weakness in the Liberal Party in that last campaign, we were in the middle of, that they had to up their game one more step, and they needed one more move, and I think they might have had a shot at winning, but they needed that one more move, and that one more move had to account for the fact that the Liberals weren't going to just die. They were going to try to take a run, and the obvious run that the Liberals would make would be at the NDP, because that's the only place that they could compete for votes. So they should have been able to that's just basic. Like, you don't need to be a campaign strategist. That is an unobvious. That's the plainest, most obvious play in the world, and they should have accommodated for that. They should have had a second gear to go to in week 3 that would have allowed them to be competitive on election day, and they didn't. And her failure to recognize that, frankly, leaves me wondering, like, what's going on with that party? She did come off as likable, but why is she still in that job? Why is it going to be that she'll have been in that job for over a decade if she's not capable of recognizing that? Maybe she's just failing to say it because she didn't want to say it, and it was a really sporting thing of her to come on and talk to you, David. But if that's her actual perspective, if I was working for the Ontario New Democrats, I'd be like, sorry, right? We need a more fundamental level of leadership here. We need a more strategic approach, because, like, if you don't get that right, you're never going to win. You're never going to come close to winning.
But who do they have? That's part of the problem. There is no heir apparent. There's no obvious successors. That's somewhat why the federal party ended up with Jagmeet Singh, who's been very underwhelming since he was leader. He took the seats down to half, like what we talked about in the last election. I think part of the issue they had, and I'm not.
Sorry, can I jump in there? Aren't there options? Like, I mean, Merritt style strikes me as pretty capable. I think there are a couple of other, you could go hard on the labor side. There's a couple of folks out there, and when it comes to Ontario NDP, I mean, in between elections, Avi Lewis seems to have no problem with using his surname and historic significance to tell people what they should do. Why doesn't he get out of his fucking lawn chair and run for something? Like, I'd be angry if I was a New Democrat. Hey, Avi, right? The pool is filled. Jump in, right? So I think there are people that if they wanted to run.
He's too smart for that. He's too smart for that. He knows you can't get elected saying any of the shit he says.
Well, probably the one thing about the NDP, and this is just one story, I don't know what you guys found, but I found them extremely arrogant. Like, I truly believed going into election day that a number of them thought they were winning, and I normally don't. So I was doing a panel, and it was on CTV, and the NDP commentator on the panel was Tom Paikin, who I'm sure you guys have probably been on panels with, and we were at the CTV studios, and so when you're doing it just for people, like there was 3 of us in studio, so you're all put into different sides of the studio in different chairs. And the chair they put me in, it wasn't being mic'd up into the feed, so they had to move me. So I didn't actually get on the panel until 1 minute in, and halfway through, basically, like the first 30 seconds I was on, Tom took a shot at me and said, well, the Ford Conservatives are so arrogant, Jenni couldn't even be bothered to make it on time, and all this, and like took a shot at me. And I just kind of like sat there, and I didn't say anything. I didn't say that was a technical problem, what have you. And I'm normally someone that does not gloat after victories, because I know what it feels like to losing almost, you remember those feelings. I don't know about you, more than like you remember winning. So I'm not a gloater. But the day after the election, I was on a panel at 6:30 a.m. and Tom was like the NDP commentator on, and it's the only time, like, he walked into the waiting room area, and I just had my makeup done, and I looked, I'm like, hey Tom, how you doing? What was your night last night? I had a great night.
Oh man.
So why did you want to be on TV that night instead of with your friends celebrating the win?
Well, listen, I missed celebrating the win. It would have been fun. I pretty much had the TV gig lined up before even I'd started working on the campaign. So as fun as it would have been to be there, I was playing my role by being there, and it was fun. Listen, it was the first time really, I think the electronic ballots, or at least that I'd been involved. It was I was shocked at kind of 7 minutes in, they declared victory, and then 12 minutes in, it was majority. So it wasn't, I was expecting it to be more drawn out than what it was.
Yeah, no, I was happy it was quick.
Sorry, I feel like an asshole now saying that stuff.
2015, I was on TV because I was part of that insiders panel that Peter Masbridge had. And so we were part of the election coverage, Kathleen Monk and Jamie Watt and I. Not 2015, 2011, sorry. 2011. And the Liberal Party is going down super hard. And I realized what I must look like. And so all I'm remembering is that you're supposed to smile on television, right? And so I keep forcing a smile onto my face.
Pharmacologically.
Somebody says on Twitter, what the fuck is Herle smiling about? The Liberals are going down to fucking shit here. And I had to actually explain to people on air, listen, I'm dying here, but I told you you're supposed to smile on television to make yourself look more genial. It's weird to be on TV on election night when a campaign's been going on.
I've done it a ton of times. My favorite, actually, is the 2014 win, when you helped guide Kathleen to victory. Improbable majority government. People didn't think it was going to happen. Because I was on air at CTV until, I don't know, like literally probably 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning. And then I came over to your place, and it was a good time, and people were happy. As I recall, you were in a rare, fantastic mood, and I think we managed to find some of Western Canada's fine Lemon Heart rum, and but then I got a note suggesting that I had to be on Canada AM at 6 a.m. So I just stayed up. I might have gotten about 45 minutes of sleep on your back deck in a lawn chair, and then I just got up and did the old wash my face and turned my jacket inside out, and off I went. But that was a great night. That was. It's much better to win than lose, I find. This is the great kind of insights you only capture here at this the Herle Burly podcast, but way better, way more fun to win than lose.
2014, my heart wasn't broken. I was at an event in Halifax, a True Patriot Love Gala in Halifax the day of the election, and some of my Ontario friends were walking around going, "Oh my God, like they lost the riding of Durham. How could they lose Durham?" And I was like,
The eerie thing for folks like us, though, is that, I mean, it's probably a little different for you, Jenni, because you're field general, but, you know, certainly particularly for me, as a guy that's just trying to write stuff, like I got nothing to do on election day. In 2004, we go to Montreal, we got campaign headquarters, we're staying at, at the Fairmont, the Queenie, and we're just, so we got nothing to do all day long. Like Chuck and I get up, we order a bucket of beer to our room, we take an hour, we write a little victory speech knowing that we were going to win, and then somebody gets the bright idea. This is actually one of the weirdest E-Day memories I have, because even though we were winning, it was super uncomfortable. Everyone says, you know what we should do? We've earned it. Let's go have a massage. And so everyone goes down to like the salon at the bottom of the Queenie, and I think
that was Terry's idea, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And everyone's wearing these terry cloth robes, and they're wandering around, and fake slipper, and I'm insanely uncomfortable. I'm not a massage guy. I don't want people like touching me, a stranger, and I'm laying on a table and I'm partially naked, which is nothing that anybody should be exposed to. And the whole thing, I'm super uncomfortable. I got the terry cloth robe. I don't wear robes, so I got the robe tied up wrong. And so that was like, and I was just like, can we stop? I don't, no more. So we had our massage, and it made me more tense. And then I just went and drank some beer, and we...
Well, while that was going on, I was trying to have a nap at the Queen Elizabeth Hotel because John Webster and Jack Fleischman and I had drank the whole night before, because we'd been out for dinner, and then we'd gone to my office at 1 o'clock in the morning to get the last overnights of the campaign, and we realized we were going to win, and we drank all night long. So I was at the Queen Elizabeth trying to have a nap, and I was awakened by Sheila Martin, the Prime Minister's wife, sitting at the edge of my bed, shaking me awake. She had the RCMP get her into my room. And she's like, "You're the only person saying he's going to win. Why are you telling him he's going to win? Don't lie to him." And I had to get out of bed, which, by the way, I was in actually even worse shape than you with your terry cloth robe. I had to get out of bed and get out my fucking data tables and start taking Sheila through the polling data to convince her that I was not lying to her husband about the fact that he was going to win that night. And I'm saying, why would I lie? Like, the polls are going to close in like 4 hours. Like, this is a very ineffective lie. But anyway, that was nobody believed.
It's distressing that your bosses would believe Daryl Bricker as compared to you, right? But that's the way love goes, I guess.
Well, in 2004, my experience was much different. I was knocking on doors and get out the vote in a P in Carleton. So
you had a modest element of. So you win that riding, so you can feel.
Yeah, we won. We beat David Pratt by over 4,000 votes.
I remember that. Yeah. I remember David Pratt. That was. Well, there we go. All right. Well, listen, it's been great, David. I'm going to go. I think it's almost 9. Time for the liquor cabinet to get rattled, and I hope you're all well.
We have a couple of mailbag questions.
Oh.
We have a couple of mailbag questions. Aliana Young, listener Aliana Young says, how does a strong federal Liberal government impact the provincial Conservative premiers? Doug Ford might be exempt from this, but I'm curious about Kenny, Moe, Pallister, etc. Does a strong and popular federal government help or hinder their political fortunes?
Well, it doesn't. I don't think it helps their fortunes at all in Saskatchewan and Alberta.
You mean doesn't help federal Liberal fortunes, you mean? I think she was asking what's the impact on the premiers of a strong and popular federal government.
Well, listen, I think this could go back to like all the polling that's happening now, and I think it might be less true with Trudeau, but I think it's definitely true with a lot of the premiers. I don't think any of this is real. I think this is a COVID hangover or a COVID whatever you want to call it. People are just generally, or at least we're generally feeling more like what Scott feels, less than what you and I feel, David. That like we're kind of all in this together. Those bullshit commercials that I just turn off the TV now when I see, like, we're all in this together, like all this kind of touchy-feely shit. I think that's starting to wane. So I think that whether it's a strong federal government now or whether it's the provinces, I think it's going to change, and it's going to change for different reasons. I've been saying, I think for Doug, it will change as, you know, the province opens up and he's kind of 5 steps behind. I think that's going to affect the Ford government. I think with Trudeau, he's doing things now that are completely contrary for his voters. If you saw the story out yesterday, the new legislation that's coming out on CERB, they're basically saying there's going to be criminal fines and jail time for people that have fraudulently applied and received the CERB, which I personally have no problem with. But it's very counterintuitive to what this government has been saying for months. They were like, everybody apply, we're there for you, apply, you're going to have it. And now they're basically saying, oh, and if you've taken it fraudulently, you're going to have to pay 3 times back what you got, and there's up to, I don't know, like a 90-day jail fine. So yeah, I think
I hate that.
And you're going to see as governments start to transition from having to deal with the day-to-day and transition into getting us out of this. Because there's 10 million Canadians applied for the CERB, and right now there's only a 4.1 million person unemployment, which is horrible, don't get me wrong, but that's a big difference.
I'll come back.
Didn't they foreshadow that? Didn't they foreshadow that with some pretty stark language about not abusing this or not taking advantage of it when it was launched? I mean, wasn't everybody hearing some kind of oddly aggressive language about that at the beginning?
That was just bad. That was bad politics at the beginning. That was Morneau sounding like he was more concerned about about forestalling abuse and actually getting programs into place that work. The CERB worked. The wage subsidy, they're begging people now to take it, so it has not been nearly as effective. So I think that was a political misstep at the outset, and I do not like this legislation. I mean, they're responding to what? Andrew Scheer? Because Andrew Scheer's been in the House of Commons saying, there's abuse going on, and you're handing this out, and we got to get
nobody's been in the House. Nobody's been in the House of Commons.
Well, wherever he's been, yeah. But I mean, and as we've discussed to death on this podcast, literally no one gives a goddamn what Andrew Scheer thinks or says. So I don't know why you'd respond to that. And I think it's going to be impossible to implement and execute. But going back to the question about, what's the effect for Kenny, as an example, if the prime minister's numbers at a federal level are pretty high and people generally approve of how he's doing? Almost zero, I think. Like, I don't think you'll hate this, Jenni, but I think that Kenny has problems, but I don't think he has problems because of a contrast with Trudeau. I don't think that federal Liberal fortunes in Alberta, I mean, maybe they'll be somewhat buoyed, but I don't think they'll be enormously buoyed. I think that Kenny's got challenges because I think that he's had trouble shifting gears during this in terms of, on the one hand, maintaining his libertarian instincts that inform a lot of his politics while managing the public health crisis and all those kinds of contradictions. And most fundamentally, we see devastation in the oil patch that was occurring already, that's exacerbated by what's happening with oil worldwide and what's happening by the economic impacts of all COVID. So I think all of that gives him a gigantic set of challenges. I think that's his problem. I'm not sure he's played his cards perfectly. He's got lots of room to dig out of it. People will give excuses, make excuses and make discounts because we've been through a crisis. But I think he's in trouble, but I don't think it has much to do with Trudeau.
See, and I disagree. I actually think, and I'm not arguing, because I think every government could end up, suffering at the end of like where people find themselves. And Alberta did have to your point, did have the challenge that heading into all of this COVID stuff, with the collapse of oil prices. But I think Jason's actually handled it well, and it's what we've talked about before. Jason, Horgan, Legault, they've taken more of the clinical approach. And if you look, Alberta grew by 23,000 jobs last month. So they're starting to make their climb. They're starting to make their climb kind of out of the economic. They're at least starting to climb their way out of like the economic problems that other provinces are seeing.
All right. Eliana, I just want to say something directly to your question, which is, regardless of any spikes in approval for the Trudeau government from time to time, it is always in the best interests of the Conservative premiers to have a Liberal government at the federal level. And because one of the great underlying trends in Canadian politics is that the longer you're in power federally, the weaker you are provincially. And you can only become strong provincially when you're out of power federally. So by the end of Pierre Trudeau's time in office, when he took office, all the provincial governments were Liberal. By the time he left office, none of them were Liberal. And then the comeback of the Liberal Party started because after Mulroney was elected within a year, the provinces started turning from Conservative to Liberal, and this trend has been repeated throughout the cycles since then. And so it's absolutely in the Conservative premier's interest for there to be, especially Ford, I would suggest, for there to be a federal Liberal government. Zachary Oche asks us quite a practical question. What is the best way to get involved in politics, especially in a leadership role? I've done some work on campaigns, recently a campaign director. Any kind of tips would be helpful.
Jenni, how'd you do it? What happened?
I went to a nomination meeting and found it very interesting. And Deb Gray came and spoke at an event a month later, and I went to that. And 2 months later, I volunteered to go on this Reform youth bus that traveled the province in the 1997
That election. Sounds like Creep City, the Reform youth bus. Woo!
But it was fun.
Who wants ginger ale and who wants grape? Let's rock.
But there was a lot of people I met that would had roles. Corey Tonight was on the bus, Ray Novak. So people that I'm friends with, 23 years later. But it ultimately was just a lot of hard, it was just basically work. It was then I moved to Ottawa and I volunteered in MP's office and I was involved in the campus club. And it was literally, I just volunteered my way until I got jobs and then just kind of worked my way
Show up and work hard. Show up and work hard, right?
So what I would suggest to people is that they just volunteer and do every opportunity that they can, especially a leadership race, and never look at anything that you're asked to do as even if you don't think you're interested, whether it's door knocking or phone banking or what have you, just do it. That's ultimately the way that that people that end up progressing. I know that people that I have taken under my wing or I have seen potential, as I was senior, are the ones that are putting in the time and putting in the effort. It's really that simple.
Although we've all had, I agree with that, 100%. Show up, work hard, show up at everything. But the other thing is we have all benefited from great mentor relationships, right? We had good people notice us early and take us under their wings and teach us and help us advance through politics. So that's an important part of it too, is connecting with people that will mentor you.
And I'd say a couple things for sure that, but almost every election and every leadership, like clockwork, and in every political party, you look around, you go, oh, there's 2 or 3 young people that come in, you go, they're gamers, and they are easy to identify right away. And you can almost say with certainty after 2 weeks in an election campaign or 2 weeks into a leadership, you can say that person's going to matter in 10 years to the party. You can just literally can see them that quick. And one thing I would add is that one of the things I love about politics, and one reason I always encourage people that are younger to go work in Ottawa or work at Queen's Park or work in your provincial capital, is that politics is still by and large a meritocracy, right? Like the guy who shows up and says, hi, I'd like to volunteer. I have some good ideas. I was hoping to be able to work on policy. You're like, get the fuck out, okay? You don't get to do policy. You earn the right to do policy after you've shown that you'll knock on 5,000 doors and stuff 5,000 envelopes.
You walk into a local campaign and want to work on policy? I don't even know what the fuck that means.
No, just hard work. And the other thing, though, is that try to do it in a leadership. I know general elections for sure too, but boy, oh boy, there is nothing more galvanizing. There is nothing more team creating than that sense of a leadership, the us against the world, even some of the unpleasant aspects, the Civil War dimensions of it, all that stuff creates. Look, in 1990, my first involvement really was in the 88 election in Kingston, but that led very rapidly to the 90 leadership, where I met David and I met Terry and I met Rick and I met Cyrus and so on and so forth. And those people remain to this day my closest circle of friends. There's the dudes from university and there's the dudes from politics, and the dudes from politics started then. And it's just, if you work hard at that level and at that time, and if you have the good fortune to be involved in leadership, you'll be tied to those people for the rest of your life or as long as you want it, because you make friendships at last.
Agreed.
Oh yeah, your best friends.
Drink.
Your best friends. Your best friends. Yeah, drink a lot. Your best friends come from politics, and that's on a day when we were a little maybe negative about politics. That's the note that we should end on. Is that. You meet some of the worst people you'll ever meet in politics, but you also meet some of the best people you'll ever meet in politics, and you make lifelong friends. Jenni, I do not want to hold you from that fishing boat any longer. Would you catch me a pickerel, please? And
I will try.
I'll fry it up with some butter. Thank you very much.
In Fenland Falls, do they say pickerel or walleye?
Pickerel.
All right.
Scott, you look a little jaundiced. Get better, will you?
Well, I'd have to go outside, and frankly, I've been scouring the rules, and I don't think that's permitted. I'm going my back step, but not my front. I don't know.
All right, guys. Love you. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye. Cheers.